Okay, what's up everyone? Episode Aegis has been out for a little while now, and with its release, I wanted to revisit the party member video I released back in February. Nearly every character got changes to their movesets and gear, and I've also been able to play the game more since my initial vid, so I figured this was a great time for an update. This video will mainly just be me giving my thoughts on the characters gameplay wise, but I thought I would also include a tier list format to keep it in line with my past vid. Keep in mind the generic disclaimer, every character is good and viable, so always just use whoever you like. I also won't really be explaining what each character does, because I assume everyone watching has at least played the journey or seen my first video. And last thing to mention, I tried to make this list based on how good I felt the characters were throughout my playthrough, not just at the very end, because I feel that's way more relevant. So first up we have Yukari. Yukari is actually one of the characters I found myself using a lot less in episode Aegis, and I'll go into reasons why. First, one of Yukari's main draws in the journey was her resource management. It wasn't ever required, but with Yukari having basically unlimited healing, it made it very easy to complete whole Tartarus sections in one go, especially if you're Brave Blade spamming every encounter. But now, if your team is low on SP, you can just run back to the dorm. Sure, you lose any major Arcana cards that you picked up, but it's a much lower penalty than losing an entire in-game day. Now when I first did my reload playthrough, I didn't use items very much, but I did dabble more this time around, and well, yeah. If you manage your resources and stock up on healing items, Yukari's main role becomes a lot less relevant. Even if you have Yukari in your team, you may find yourself needing to use items at times, mainly ailment curing ones, as she is only able to cure mental ailments for a large portion of the game, and she herself can get afflicted. Besides the item thing, another reason I found myself not needing Yukari as much was the addition of Metis. Yukari's main element for hitting enemy weaknesses is wind, and would you look at that, Metis learns Garula very early on, making the wind coverage pretty redundant. Speaking of which, Koro's characteristic can auto-lower enemies' agility, at least for the first 3 turns, making Yukari's only debuff less necessary as well. This may just seem like I'm dogpiling on Yukari, but I'm mainly just stating reasons I found myself using her less. She does have the AoE concentrate on her second Theurgy, but this is unlocked pretty late, and the sad truth is, magic is a lot weaker than Fizz in Reload, making it not nearly as impactful as it might seem. It is still fun to use sometimes, if you're taking a break from spamming Fizz moves every fight. So yeah, those were my thoughts on Yukari. I still think she's a great character, just that a lot of her strengths can be easily replicated by other sources, such as items, Metis, and Koro. And episode Aegis, not needing SP management nearly as much, was also a factor. Next up is Junpei, and in this case, he's someone I actually used much more in episode Aegis compared to base Reload. Junpei is a character that strives off physical damage and critical hits, but during my journey playthrough, early to mid game he didn't feel as impactful to me, so I preferred to run Aegis, who was another physical character with buffs, was more tanky, and had more useful passives. Now well, Aegis is the MC, but I also tried to use Junpei more to see if I had written him off too early. And yeah, Junpei definitely performed, at least for me. Especially once I had at least one stack of his characteristic unlocked, along with Revolution support from Koro, Junpei was able to rack up a lot of critical hits and output really good damage for a party member. I still think Junpei is kind of a snowball character. He ramps up as the game progresses and flourishes late game when you have access to App Pupil and slash boosting gear. But my initial assessment of Junpei being okay mid game and broken only at the end was definitely a bit too harsh. At the end of the day, he's the physical crit character in a game dominated by physical and critical hits, so I definitely put him in the amazing tier. It's also pretty funny that you can gear him out as a mage, and his second Theurgy does more magic damage than either Mitsuru or Akihiko. Speaking of which, we have my boy Akihiko, and well, I have some thoughts. Now I love Aki, I had like a 5-minute diatribe in my initial video about why he was better than what people might initially think. Basically, the translation team did Aki dirty, his Theurgy charges faster if he has any type of buff on him, he doesn't have to cast it himself, and his characteristic increases the effects of any buff, such as Tarukaja increasing his attack by 1.82 times rather than the normal 1.4. With that out of the way, I didn't use Akihiko that much in my episode Aegis playthrough, mainly because he often felt like the odd man out. Starting out, Akihiko doesn't have access to buff boost, let alone buff amp. His move selection also leaves much to be desired. He only has Zio at the beginning, while Ken starts right off the bat with Zionga. A more egregious one is him having Sonic Punch, one of the weakest Fizz moves, as is only one for a solid 27 levels. Cause this is a list based on the entire game, Akihiko learning good moves after other party members doesn't really help him. Early game, unless you really need his Tarunda, I feel like there's little reason to use him over Ken, who has electric coverage as well as much more utility. Late game, when you have strike boosting gear and his characteristic fully unlocked, he shines much more, but then faces pretty stiff competition from Metis. Metis kinda stole Akihiko's place in the late game Fizz fan party due to her having a Fizz Theurgy, charge, among other things. So in the early game, it was hard to justify Aki over Ken, and late game, the same thing applies but with Metis. He's still pretty much the only character who can excel in both Fizz and Magic at the same time, and can be the tankiest due to defense buffs having more impact on him. But I feel like late move unlocks and overlap with other party members hold him back a bit. Because of that, I just put him in the great tier. The next party member is Mitsuru. Mitsuru is one of the characters who got the biggest change in terms of moveset and gear because she now has access to Vorpal Blade. Not only that, but she can actually equip slash and crit boosting gear to become a physical damage dealer. The catch is, Vorpal Blade is unlocked super late at level 79, and despite these upgrades, her physical damage isn't on par with Metis, Junpei, or Akihiko. Still, it's an interesting build path if you want to try it. Now, I used Mitsuru quite a bit during my Journey playthrough, not for her ice damage, and definitely not for ailments, but because she had access to the best debuff in Rakunda. That still holds true in episode Aigis, but one thing I noticed was that many more of the tougher encounters, like door bosses, featured multiple enemies. So until level 68 when she learned Maracunda, you had to spend time debuffing one by one. Just like with Yukari, I did use items more during my playthrough, and if you go to the antique store pretty early on, you're able to buy the Atrophying Sutra, which lowers all foes' defense. You can't buy a million of these right away, but you can buy a decent amount for important fights. That resulted in me having items that performed Mitsuru's main role better than her for a good portion of the game, making me not bring her as often. Another reason Mitsuru saw less play for me, and stop me if you heard this before, was the introduction of Metis. In addition to having wind coverage, Metis starts off with ice. So if I needed a party member to hit ice weaknesses, I already had one. Mitsuru is still a good damage dealer in the late game once you get all her gear, but kinda similar to Yukari, I found her main roles to be too easily replicated by things like items and Metis. Even for ailments, as you progress, Aigis can apply distress to enemies just by ambushing them. Following this is Ken. Ken is a character that already had a really stacked kit, with healing, screens, elemental coverage, among other things. It seems the devs didn't think this was enough, as he got buffed in episode Aigis. Ken now learns 3 more Pierce moves in Arrow Rain, Cruel Attack, and Myriad Arrows, with the first 2 being learned almost immediately. While Ken is still very much a support, this makes his damage in the early game quite a bit better, and he now has an AoE Pierce move to use. In the journey, I didn't use Ken as much, because while he had great utility, I rarely felt like I needed that much defense. Part of that is definitely because of how dumb Scarlet Havoc was, deleting enemies on the first turn. Now that Scarlet Havoc got axed, and combat is generally more challenging, I definitely appreciated Ken's kit more. His coverage of Electric, Light, and Pierce help a lot early on, and Tetrakarn and Makarakarn can save you in some situations. It's also worthy to note that Ken learns Meteorama, Samarikarm, and Meteorahan much earlier than Yukari, even by up to 15 levels. So he often does the healer job better, earlier. Also, if you keep Ken's SP consistently below half, he is by far the fastest gauge of any party member, getting it back in 3 turns. And Ken's second Theurgy is still nuts, essentially being 11 actions in 1 move. So, Ken is great, I definitely underrated him in my initial ranking, but he just has an insane amount of utility, whether you need healing, screens, knockdowns, etc, etc. So I'd place him in the amazing tier, and I think that if a person insists on always running a healer, he could place even higher. The second last party member is Koromaru. Koro was arguably the best party member back in the journey, due to him being the premier physical support in a game where physical is king. Moving to episode Aegis, Koro did get adjusted a bit. He now no longer starts with 2 Theurgies, which is pretty understandable because having Power Howling right from the get-go was pretty OP. In addition, the move of Getsue got removed universally because moon cycles are no longer a thing. Getsue was actually Koro's best physical move before because it got a 75% bonus on full moons, which is generally where you'd be fighting bosses anyways. He did get Swift Strike to hit more weaknesses, but these were 2 major adjustments. Despite these things, I still think Koro's a very good party member. He still has fire and dark coverage, and he gets Revolution very early on. Revolution is a flat 15% increase to your whole team's crit rate, and I found this to be useful in making Metis, Junpei, even Aegis, more consistent in landing critical hits. Now, Revolution does have a downside because it buffs everyone, including enemies, so you do have to be careful. But most of the time, it was a nice gain, especially if enemies only use magic. But it is the case in episode Aegis that I feel Koro is similar to Junpei, where he snowballs and gets better and better as the game progresses. Once you finally unlock Power Howling, the full Fizz team with him, Junpei, and Metis really takes off. Masuku Kaja is a good buff, and of course there's Debilitate. Debilitate is pretty much only relevant for the final story boss, but hey, it's great there. So for Koro, I'd still put him in the amazing tier. He takes more time to pop off than he did during the journey, but he's still the physical support in a physical dominated game. And last but not least is Metis, the new party member added in episode Aegis. Metis to me is easily the best character for a number of reasons. She gets access to both wind and ice magic for knockdowns, Taro Kaja, which is the most useful buff, as well as many good strike and slash moves. She's the only party member to learn charge naturally, and she gets the same useful passives that Aegis did during the journey in Insta-Heal, Enduring Soul, and Resist Fizz. She even learns the Kaja to prevent enemies from stacking buffs. Her characteristic Sister Amp increases her damage by 20 to 40% whenever she gets shifted to from Aegis, and she has 2 great strike Theurgies, even if the first one does put her out of the player's control for a little while. Oh, she also has no weaknesses, so you never have to worry about that. And this is a pretty min-max thing, but her late game gear options are the best out of any party member because she can easily run Strike Boost, Strike Amp, and App Pupil. Metis feels like a slightly adjusted version of Shinjiro if he was still around. She has no weaknesses, uses strike moves, has charge, and does a lot of damage. I mean, they even use the same ultimate weapon. Metis definitely goes in the best tier for me. She's not 100% perfect. In situations when you're not able to shift, she loses some value because her Theurgy condition and characteristic won't work. Her luck stat is also not the highest, so she won't be critting all the time. But in like 99% of scenarios, she's extremely worth using. Alright, that was my list for the party members in episode Aegis. For a good chunk of my playthrough, my preferred team was Metis, Koro, and Ken. The main reason being, this team had perfect coverage. Metis had wind and ice, Koro had fire and dark, and Ken had electric and light. Plus there were multiple ways to hit any Fizz weaknesses. And it was nice in early to mid game to run a healer as I didn't have all the money for healing items. Later on, especially once Koro learned Power Howling, I ended up using the classic Fizz spam team with Metis and Junpei. As long as you manage your items well, this is for sure the highest damage team in general. Another nice thing about this team is that you have every buff covered, with Metis having attack, Junpei defense, and Koro agility. Then I just use items for healing and defense down, and eventually Koro learned Debilitate. For Aki, Mitsuru, and Yukari, I still think they're really good, just that there's a few things holding them back. If magic was more on par with Fizz, things might be different. Aki has 2 magic Theurgies, Mitsuru is still very much a magic character despite the Vorpal Blade stuff, and Yukari has the AoE Concentrate. Sadly, that's not the case. There is some Metis syndrome as well. She covers Strike, Ice, and Wind, so these characters' elements were not as impactful to me. Regardless, you could run a team with Akihiko, Mitsuru, and Yukari the whole way through and beat things perfectly fine even on hardest difficulty. so the moral of the story is still play how you want. Anyways, thank you to everyone who watched up until this point. I'm definitely a combat enjoyer, so I had a lot of fun with episode Aigis. After this, I might go back to completing some SMT5 videos because I did have a few I wasn't able to work on prior to this. Till then, see ya.